We're going to start again from the Amar Abaye. Amar Abaye is going to talk. Amar Abaye is about 10 lines from the top, maybe, um, and talks about the laws of lavud, filling in an empty airspace, and where you could say lavud. And so we started it, but we didn't get too far. So we're going to start it again now. 10 lines from the top of the page, 18a. Amar Abaye, Avir Shloisha Besukkah Gedola. When you have empty space on a Sukkah Gedola, on a large Sukkah, which means that the Sukkah does not have any issue with the minimum measurement. It's large, it's a large Sukkah, and so that's not an issue. The minimum measurement's got kosher schach for enough of that it would need, but it's too big of an empty space that it could break your sukkah into two, because the empty space goes along the middle all the way to the front entrance. So it basically now causes your sukkah to be divided. And what is that minimum size that would, what's the smallest size that would make the sukkah broken into two? It's an empty airspace of 3 handbreadths. So if you have 3 handbreadths of empty airspace, it is going to invalidate your sukkah. Now, when you have that, miyatoy, what happens if you minimize that 3 handbreadth space by filling it in with kosher schach? Of course, it's going to be fine. What about if you fill it in with non-kosher schach? That also is going to be fine based on the previous Gemara that we learned that even non-kosher schach can sometimes help you because it minimizes the empty space, and they fall into 2 different categories. There's the empty space category, and there's the non-kosher schach category. And each one has a minimum size of its own, and they don't combine together. So if you have empty space that's too big, you could put in non-kosher schach, and you will you will rectify your sukkah. So whether you used reeds, which are kosher schach, whether you use
just leave them and I'll take them out.
Whether you used spudin, spits, which are either made of metal or they're made of wood, but they have a little piece of metal at the end, and they're considered to be susceptible to impurity. They're considered like a final finished product, and they're not usable for schach, even if they're wood, because they have that little piece of metal which changes the entire entity of the spit to be a spit that is susceptible to impurity. It's invalid for schach. So even if you use spits to fill in that empty space, havi miyot, that is a minimizer. It minimizes the space. It is an avenue to minimize the space of the empty space, and it'll now fall into 2 categories instead of 1. You have a small amount of empty space, and you have a small amount of non-kosher schach, which now is not going to separate, it's not going to divide your sukkah into 2, because each of them have not reached their threshold to invalidate your sukkah and to cut your sukkah in half. Now, that's by a big sukkah. Now, besukkah katana, by a small sukkah, so if you fill in that gap with kosher schach, then it'll work. But kanim havi miut, if you have kosher schach, reeds, havi miut, that will be a way to minimize the gap. It'll be a miut. It's a good miut. It's a good minimizer. Bishbudin, but with non-kosher schach, then you're going to have a problem. What's the problem if you use non-kosher schach to a small sukkah? Well, the problem is that a small sukkah does not have the minimum requirement of kosher schach. There's a minimum requirement of kosher schach in a small sukkah, and that minimum requirement is not there if you have a gap. So imagine a sukkah that's 7 by 7, 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths, and you have a gap of space. So now your schach no longer is 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths. Now, if you have a gap of space that's 3 handbreadths, how big is your schach? It's also about 3.5, 3 3 3/4. Maybe it's even 4. Maybe you have exactly 4, but you have a gap of 3 handbreadths. And that is going to cause that your schach is not enough. And therefore, if you minimize it with kosher schach, great. You minimize it with non-kosher schach, then you're still going to have the same problem that you have a sizable area that is non-kosher. You have non-kosher schach, or it's empty space, but it's too big of a gap to be considered to make your sukkah a kosher sukkah.
So
if it's less than 3, then you could say, well, you still don't have 7 by 7, but that will work. If it's less than 3 gap, less than 3 handbreadths of a gap, it will be batel to the sukkah. It'll be nullified to the sukkah, and it'll be kosher. Yes, Jeffrey.
So, but we already saw that if you redistribute, as in one of the cases we talked about last week, if you redistribute the non-kosher schach and the kosher schach, so that there's a smaller amount of each alternating, then you can fix it probably without anything else.
So that works in a big sukkah, but it won't work in a small sukkah, as Abaye said in the previous page, where Abaye said, Rabba, that works, this is good by a big sukkah. But what about a small sukkah? He says, Amar le Abaye on the top of 17b, on the 6th line over there, or the 5th line, it says, or 6th line, yeah. Amar le Abaye, Ulamar nami nehidalai shavu shiurayu b'sukkah gedayla b'sukkah katana milo shavu shiurayu. On a small sukkah, it's going to be equal. In other words, both of them are going to ruin your sukkah at 3 handbreadths. So that's what we're sort of basing this on. This is Abaye's statement as well. So it's very similar to what he said earlier.
Thank you.
Okay, so what we've just concluded here is that when you have a big sukkah and you have an empty space of 3 handbreadths, so there is an easy way out, which is even use non-kosher schach, and you'll minimize the gap. With a small sukkah, the only way to do it is using kosher schach. That's how you can minimize the gap. But non-kosher schach will not minimize that gap because you don't have sufficient amount of kosher schach to make it a proper valid sukkah, because you're talking about a minimum sukkah, which is the sukkah itself is only 7 by 7, and now you have an empty space of 3 handbreadths out of that 7 that has no schach on. So you've got only 4 handbreadths of schach, 3 handbreadths, which is a significant size of empty space. So we're not going to consider your sukkah a valid sukkah. However, if you minimize it with kosher schach, and you minimize that gap of 3 handbreadths to less than 3 handbreadths, then it will be usable as a sukkah, even though you don't have 7 full handbreadths by 7 handbreadths of kosher schach. You have a gap. Nevertheless, it will be a kosher sukkah. And the reason is because it'll be batel. The empty space there will be nullified and submit itself, so to speak. It'll become part of the kosher sukkah. The empty space is batel. It's nullified. Okay, now the Hani Mili. Now the Gemara says this very surprising addition or qualification, I should say, to this rule. The Hani Mili menatzad. This works on the side of your sukkah, that you started your sukkah with kosher schach and you ended it too early So you have a gap between the end of your kosher schach and the wall. So it's from the side, you have an empty gap. The gap goes all the way up to the side. That's when this discussion applies. Aval b'yamtza, but in the middle of the sukkah, if you have a gap of less than 3 handbreadths, then pligi ba Rav Acha v'Ravina, Rav Acha and Ravina argue about such a case. So in other words, if you have an empty space on the side, then we'll say this law of lavud. But if you have an empty space in the middle of your schach, then there seems to be an argument here if we will allow you to say lavud in the middle of your sukkah. Now, you may ask, why not? Right? Why shouldn't you say lavud? Lavud is means everything is becomes connected, or it's considered filled in. So why should it work on this? Why shouldn't it work in the middle of your schach? Why does it only work on the side? So it could be that the Gemara's understanding that lavud is a law in the walls. It's not a law in the schach, maybe something along those lines. Additionally, I did see you brought down this concept that this is the Ran that says that part, that it's a law in the walls. I guess the reason why they're saying that is because when we talked about the halacha l'moshe misinais, we mentioned 3 of them together. What did we say? Mechitzin. We mentioned shiurin, chatzitzin, umechitzin is halacha l'moshe misinai. Now, what were the cases of mechitzin? Mechitzin included good, lavud, and daifed akum. Good means good asik, which means you make the wall extended. Lavud means you complete a gap. You complete a gap that's up to 3 handbreadths. And daifed akuma is you make a wall from something that looks like a ceiling. You can bend the wall. So these all seem to be laws that are connected to walls. In fact, the term is mechitzin. So that's why that's why at least one opinion would hold that lavud is a law in the walls and it doesn't work in the schach. Now there is another understanding that I saw brought down, and that is that if you say lavud in the middle of the schach, what happens is we're going to move over the schach to fill in the gap. But if you move over the schach to fill in the gap, you're still going to be stuck with a gap at the other end. However, if you use lavud on the side, then what happens is you're extending the wall to the schach. And by extending the wall to the schach, in that scenario, you're not, what are you losing? You don't lose any schach. You're just pulling the wall further. If you have to pull the schach further because the gap is in the middle of the sukkah, in the middle of the roof of the sukkah, so you're pulling all the schach over and you end up with a gap. If you're pulling the wall, so what are you losing? You're not losing any schach. So that's why on the side, it's better than in the middle. Now, my question on that is, but then you're pulling the wall, so now you have a gap in the wall.
Yeah, it's not
so
the
how
best.
Does that work? Now
it's not the best solution.
So I'm not sure I understand that solution completely, but it is brought down.
then you have to use Dofen Akuma at the same time.
So that's what I was thinking, that you could have Dofen Akuma. The only problem with that is that Dofen Akuma doesn't. No, maybe you would say good asik. Dofen Akuma wouldn't work because you have empty space.
Right.
But maybe you would say good asik. But good asik only works if you have a solid amount.
And you have to have 10
hand breaths. If you have less than 10 hand breaths, then you don't say good asik. So are you going to say that you can't do that you can't do lavud? That are you going to say that on a small sukkah you can't do lavud from the side? Because on a small, in other words, a short sukkah. Let me just say that you have a short sukkah. So what's going to happen is that you're going to pull the wall further, and it'll reach the schach now because it's less than 3 hand breaths. So we'll say lavud, and that would work. It's on the side of the sukkah, so it should work according to everyone because we're pulling the wall. We're not pulling the schach. Okay, so we now have the whole schach area is set. We pulled the wall over. It reaches the schach, and now you have a gap of up to 3 hand breaths on the wall. So this is a short sukkah. It only has let's say 8 hand breaths now because you moved over 2 hand breaths to the side because of you used lavud, which allowed you to pull it over. But now you have a gap in the wall. So seemingly, I'm not sure how how that works. Why that? How you could explain it that way.
Also, I found it very difficult to understand about the small sukkah, the 7 by 7 tefachim. I couldn't imagine that it was just for a one-person sukkah, a minimum size, but rather that 7 by 7 is the space that's kosher above the person. That there might be more larger, but the 7 by 7 is only the kosher schach, which is somewhat in the middle, and with the non-kosher schach going through the wall.
You could have right. You could have such a sukkah called with a Dofen Akuma sukkah, yes. But so, the fact is that a sukkah that is 7 by 7 exact is still kosher, even without the non-kosher schach around. It's still kosher.
Yes, but if you have this, then you can say lavud. Then you would think you'd say lavud on the top.
Now that last sentence that you said, I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, so let's say this, it's not a tiny sukkah that's just for one person, that the whole top or the whole roof is 7 by 7.
Okay.
But that the space that has kosher schach is 7 by 7.
Okay.
And you have non-kosher schach then. And as long as the non-kosher schach is less than 3 hand breadths on the top, why can't you say lavud then on the top? It seemed to me in some of the Mishnahs that I looked at that there was a possibility of considering that and not Dofen Akuma because you have non-kosher schach at the end.
So this is the thing. You have non-kosher schach at the end, which should allow you to do Dofen Akuma up to 4 cubits. Up to 4 cubits in your scenario. And you don't need lavud in that scenario.
All right.
So that's what it seems like, yeah.
But so that we're saying Dofen Akuma can include
only includes non-kosher schach. It doesn't include empty space.
Because that becomes the wall.
That becomes the wall.
Right.
Okay, so the Gemara here continues. And the Gemara is going to explain these 2 views. So we've got Rav Acha and Ravina. Let me read it one more time. Pligi ba. They argue in this. Rav Acha or Ravina. Rav Acha and Ravina. We're on page 18a. And we are about maybe 13 lines from the top. Pligi ba Rav Acha or Ravina. Chad amar yesh lavud be'emtza. One says you say lavud in the middle. V'chad amar ein lavud be'emtza. You will not say lavud in the middle of your sukkah. And again, we just explained that there is a thought that you only say lavud when lavud means you attach the 2 sides, that you only do that when there's a gap of empty space, only if it's on the side of your sukkah. But we do not say that, according to one opinion, on the gap is in the middle of the sukkah. Now, my time demand amar yesh lavad bam. So, what would be the reason to say lavad in the middle? So the Gemara explains the Tanya because we have a brisa. And the brisa talks about the laws of mavoy on Shabbos. If there is a beam that goes out of one wall, so you have a beam on. This is talking about on a for Shabbos to carry, and you want to carry in this mavoy. This mavoy is a alley. The alley is closed off on three sides. It's according to biblical law, according to the Torah, you're allowed to carry, and it's called Rishus Hayachid. It has three walls to it, but the fourth wall is not closed off, and it opens up. Not only is it open, it's open to the Rishus Harabim, to the public domain. So because it's open to the public domain, the rabbis were concerned, and they said you need to put. It looks too similar to a, that it's as if it's connected to a public domain, and therefore you need to put some type of a heker or machitza. You need to put a wall or a recognition that this is different, that this is considered private domain. What do? So you either put a pole or you put a beam across. And that beam is going to be considered like your wall, or it'll be considered like a heker or recognition that you are closing it off. And that would be the way to validate your mavoy and make it a kosher mavoy, make it a kosher alley that you could carry. And in addition to doing the shituf mavois and that you would you would collect the food and consider it the join by the other people. But now you've also kosher the actual mavoy, the alley. Yes, Victor.
If you put this beam, does that create a need now that it's a beam? It's like almost like a doorway. It would need a mezuzah on the door on it. Is that what we're trying to create, something that's like that, or?
So I don't think there would be any obligation in a mezuzah, because you're going from you're not in, it's all outside. So I'm not really sure if that would be, I mean, that's an interesting question, because if your door opens,
well, it would be in Eretz Yisrael, maybe in Eretz Yisrael.
Maybe you're right. The reason I'm thinking is if you have an enclosed backyard and your door opens to the outside from your, you go out, you go from your house to the backyard, basically. So if it's enclosed, that's when you do put up a mezuzah. So here also you're saying you're going into an enclosed area, basically, because you're going into this mavoy. Maybe it would need a mezuzah. Even if you're outside, I have to look up in the laws of mezuzah how that would, if there's any source for such a thing. I know we do put a mezuzah up on our door if we use it to go outside in the back, if it's enclosed. If it's not enclosed, then you don't put up a mezuzah. If it's enclosed, that's when you put up a mezuzah. So here also it's an interesting question, Victor. I'll have to look up the laws of mezuzah.
Thank you.
Yes, Jeffrey.
But in this situation, there are other courtyards that open into the mavoy also. They're accessible through the mavoy. And then at the end, it's closed.
Right. True. Correct. So
it's an entrance to an entrance.
That's also an interesting point. In any event, let me look into it.
And it's also temporary. I mean,
it's what?
It's sort of temporary. It's just for Shabbos.
Okay. All right. Take that into consideration. Yeah. Good point.
But we do use loved here, right? If you can't reach both across.
So yeah, that's what the Gemara is. Okay, that's what we're gonna say. So let's continue. So it says the opinion that says you say love it even in the middle, the Tanya, because we have a brisa that you have that beam and it's going from one wall of your mavui of your alley to the other wall. So it's supposed to cover that fourth wall with this beam. you're putting it across the top. And the problem is what happens if your beam doesn't reach. So it's going from one to the next, but it doesn't reach it. And the same would be if you have two beams that are, I guess, too short, and you're putting them on each side and hoping that they'll join, but because one goes from this wall, and one goes from the other wall. So you got the two beams, and you're trying to close off that fourth wall with these two beams. But the problem is that the Einon Noigois Zu Bazu, and they don't touch each other. They're a little too short. So if it's Pachas Mishloisha, if it's less than 3 handbreadths, you don't have to bring another beam. But Shloisha, if it is 3 handbreadths, yeah, you do have to bring another beam. So this is the case where you see that if it's less than 3, even in the middle, you basically see that we are able to use the law of Lovett, and this is in the middle of the beam. It's not by a wall. It's by it's connecting the beam. In other words, you're stretching the beam further. You're not stretching the wall to the beam. So this basically shows us that you say Lovett in the middle of a sukkah as well, because you could stretch a beam, which would be like this roof, and it's not a problem. So the question is, so what does the other opinion do? Why would they say you can't do this? You have a Mishnah. So v'idach, what does the other opinion do? Shani Kuris Rabbanon. This law of the Eruv, is basically it's all a rabbinic law. So the rabbi said this is good enough. They said, in other words, the rabbis permitted it. Not that it really works in the laws of Lavud. The laws of Lavud it wouldn't do. But the rabbi said it's good enough. You have it. You're missing the gap up to 3. It's good enough, and you don't have to fix it. And the whole prohibition of carrying is only rabbinic law, so it's not a problem. So you can't learn from this to the laws of Sukkah. Sukkah is a problem, but Sukkah you can't use Lovett maybe in the middle, but for carrying on a mavoi, that you could use it. You could use Lovett. It's a rabbinic law. They allowed it. They said up to 3. Up to 3 handbreadths is no problem. Okay, so then the Gemara says, well, what's the reason of the other opinion? My time with the Amar ain't Lovett Bamsa. What's his source? Why would you not use Lovett in the middle of the sukkah? So Ditnai, because he has a Mishnah. We learned in a Mishnah. And here you get into the laws of Tumah. Aruba Shebe Bias. If you have this hole, which is like a sky roof, a skylight. You have a skylight in your roof, and it has an entrance of a handbreadth, which means that it's a handbreadth by a handbreadth hole. So you're being nice calling it a skylight. It could be that you got a hole in your roof. Now it's a skylight. So the skylight now is going to we're going to deal with can your house now be considered like a tent, because it does have that empty space in it. It has that empty space, and if something that's contaminated, that's impure, is under the empty space, so if we look at it, that's really empty space, then the contamination doesn't go all around the house, because there's no tent that blocks it from shooting upward, and instead it just shoots upward, and tumah ratzutza it's called. But if there's a tent, if there's something, if we consider it closed in, then the tumas goes all into the tent, and it surrounds the tent, it fills the tent. Anything in that tent will be impure. So the question here is that you have this sizable hole, and we'll soon see what happens if it's less than this size. Here we're talking about a size of a tefach, a handbreadth by a handbreadth. So you have a handbreadth by a handbreadth, and what we're going to say now is that in that scenario, if the tumah, the contamination, the impurity is under the hole, guess what? Everything in the house is fine. It's kosher. It's pure. It's no problem, because the tumah impurity is not under a tent that makes the impurity go to the whole tent. The same law applies the opposite. What happens if the impurity is in the house? So if it's in the house under the roof part, not under the hole, but it's under the roof, then the impurity goes to the whole house, except for anything under that hole is not going to reach, the impurity is not going to reach there, because the impurity will go all around it, but it won't reach there because that area is not under the same tent. That area is under the sky. So it's not under the same tent. The impurity doesn't fill it. So that's what the Mishnah starts off with. Then it talks about the case where the hole is even less than a handbreadth. So the Mishnah says as follows: the Aruba Shabatikras Habayis. Aruba Shababayis. Aruba, this hole that's inside a house, that's inside a hole, a window that's in the roof of the house. Uva Paisech Tefach, and it has an opening of a handbreadth. Tuma Babais, if the impurity is in the house, Kulai Tame, it is the entire house is Tame, meaning the impurity is under the roof part of the house. So the whole house is Tame, and Masha Aruba Tahar. Whatever is opposite the hole is going to be pure because it's not under that same tent. So what do we see from there? Do we say that Lavud attaches the hole to be considered like it's filled in? Do we consider that hole to be filled in? And the answer is no, we don't. And what's the reason? So the understanding is because it's in the middle of the house. If it would be on the side of the house, then maybe we would say that that it fills it in. But if it's in the middle of the roof, be'emtza, then we don't use the law of lavud, and instead we say you've got a gap. A gap is a gap, and the stuff under it is not going to be impure, and that's what it says right now. Tuma keneged aruba. If you have impurity under the skylight, that it uses the term it's opposite the skylight, which means it's under it. So kol habayis kulaitar, the whole house is pure. Why? Because this impurity is under a gap. It's not under a filled-in lavud. There's no lavud there. We don't say lavud. We don't say this law that it's considered filled in. So you see from another case, the laws of Tumah, that we don't say lavud in the middle of the house. Now, what happens if it's less than a handbreadth? Ein baruba paisech tefach. If the hole in the roof does not have a handbreadth by a handbreadth space, so it's very small, do we then say lavud? So Tuma babayas, if the impurity is in the house, can I get a ruba tahar? Opposite the hole, it is considered pure because the impurity is in the house. It's under the roof, and anything under the roof is going to be impure. But anything under that hole, even though the hole is so small, it's less than a handbreadth by a handbreadth. Nevertheless, anything under that is not under the roof. It is going to be pure. It's going to stay pure because it's not under that same roof as the impurity. Tuma keneged aruba, if there's impurity opposite the hole, so the impurity is there, do we say that it causes the whole house to be impure? No, kol habayis kulaitar, the whole house is pure. Why? Because this impurity is under the hole. It doesn't have a tent locking that causes it to lock in the impurity to the whole house and spread the impurity and contaminate the whole house. No. Why? Because there's a hole smaller than a tefach by a tefach, smaller than a handbreadth by a handbreadth. Small hole, but the hole will keep the impurity from that hole will cause it not to spread. Now it will cause it not to spread in the area, wherever to that area, or from that into that area or out of that area. It won't spread because there's a hole. So now what we see from the entire Mishnah basically is we do not say love. That's the fact. Now the question is, what's the difference if the hole is bigger than a handbreadth or smaller than a handbreadth? Does anyone see any difference there? The Mishnah divided these into two separate categories. If the hole is bigger than a handbreadth, gave the whole rundown. The hole is smaller than a handbreadth, the whole rundown. What's the difference between the two? Is there any halachic difference? So, of course, Rashi is bothered with this, and everyone is bothered with this. Why does it divide it into two? It's the same halacha. It just repeated itself twice. It's quite redundant. But Rashi explains that if you look in the Mishnah there, it does talk about other laws that do have a difference if it's a handbreadth or non-handbreadth. Regarding this law, it actually is exactly the same. So regarding what we need to know, it's no difference if it's a handbreadth or less than handbreadth. The law is the same, that we do not say love it. We don't attach it. Even though it's a small hole, it's not considered attached, and therefore the opinion that uses this Mishnah says the same thing should apply to Sukkah. We don't say love it in the middle.
So if you have it's a side thing, but if you have the impurity further away in the house and you move the impurity under the hole in the roof, does it also release the rest of the house?
It won't release it. It's too late.
Too late.
Too late.
We have customs, right? Like to open windows when someone has died in a house, but it's not the same situation because it's in the side, it's not in the roof. But there's other related.
There's a minhag, you're saying, after a person passes away that they open the window.
Yeah.
Right. Does that have to do with tumah? I don't think so. I'm not sure because the laws of tumah are very complicated, and they do talk about if there's another way out.
Yes.
There's something like that. There is such cases, but it seems that it has something to do with the neshama, opening the window or something like that. It doesn't. I don't think it's connected to the tumah.
And similarly, if you had a trap door in the roof, then just opening it would not change the situation. It's too late.
Right. Once the thing causes impurity, it doesn't go away. Yeah.
So it's hard to conceive of this happening.
Hard to conceive of, right, how something could be impure only under that space. How did it become impure?
And how it could happen that it just happens to be there, because if you move it, it doesn't matter.
Right. Well, the only thing I could think of if something fell in, maybe from the hole. But yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question.
A bird that happens to die, right, and then just falls straight through the hole.
A mouse dies right there. The poison, the thing, the poison kicked in. Right, it's one of the.
That's not the same kind of
impurity. No, but would oil work for that tumah? Yeah, no oil. Why? The tumas shrotzim. There's no oil. Oil doesn't work on tumas shrotzim.
Only if you touch it or carry it.
It doesn't have tumas oil. Only person has tumas oil.
No, only not a person, but no, you could have a bone. You could have one bone. If that happened, you don't have to have a whole body. You could have certain measurement that.
Right, a revius dam. Let's say revius dam. You're right. It could be. Yeah, I'm just giving another example. I'm not 100% sure about the laws of tumas shrotzim.
No, the problem for the Kohanim is that if it happened in the mikdash, that they couldn't touch it. You couldn't carry it. So even if you touch it, pushed it into a pail without touching it, you can't carry it.
Okay, fine. Anyway, so the case, the point that the Gemara is bringing is that we see that you do not say lavud, and because we see you don't say lavud, it must be because it's in the middle. If it would be on the side, maybe you would say lavud. And he clearly says it's I mean, this opinion is understanding that it's in the it doesn't say it clearly. That's the truth. It doesn't say clearly that it's in the middle of the house. I guess it's just understood. It's aruba shebabayis. It doesn't say it's clearly in the middle, but I guess it's understood that you don't make a hole. You don't have a skylight on the side of the house. So it must be in the in other words, what I'm asking is, what would happen if this hole was on the side? Would it seems a little like it seems like the Mishnah should have clarified that if it's on the side. I guess it wasn't. It's not a normal thing to have a hole on the side. I guess the house could fall down or something. Maybe it's not. It could be too close to the main beams. I don't know. For whatever reason, it's not. It just doesn't look symmetrical. I guess wouldn't look good. But then again, some of these arubas, I'm guessing, came because not you wanted the aruba. They probably came because the house something fell in or something. That would be my thought, but maybe not. Maybe it is maybe they used to specifically make these sunroofs, skylights.
Yeah.
Okay, so
and sometimes they use the roof for fruit and for drying things. So there would have been a door, and if it happens to be open, then I think this would apply. If the door was not open first, it wouldn't help. But if it's open, because
it could be
going up and
it could
down,
be the attic, right? It could be that there's a ladder that goes. They go through that hole to the
right, even to the roof.
Roof.
In the Yitzchok, because they dried fruit on the roof, and they also spread also things that you don't eat that they had to dry out.
Yeah, right. They used to dry fruits, dry figs and dates. Okay, so so it sounds like you have a proof from here about Lavan. So the Gemara answers Shani Hilchas Tuma the Hachi Gemirilu. The laws of Tuma are different because Rashi says Hachi Gemirilu mi Sinai, because we learned them from Har Sinai that you don't say Lavan in when it comes to when it comes to the laws of Tuma, and at least if the hole is in the middle, and we can't learn from there to another halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Now, it is interesting that we're looking at the laws of Tuma regarding a tefach, even though when we talk about Lavan, we talk about 3 handbreadths. And that seems to have to do with the fact that in the laws of Tuma, anything about what we consider connected, which is less than 3, the laws of Tuma seems to switch it to that it follows a rule generally of 1 handbreadth. So that's why it seems like the understand that that's not a problem to deal that we're dealing with. We're comparing the laws of Tuma, that's 1 handbreadth. The laws of the regular laws of Lavan apply to 3, but it's basically similar, even though it has a different measurement, but it's a similar law. Just regarding Tuma, everything seems to follow this law of 1 handbreadth. Anyway, in any event, that is the 2 opinions about Lavan. Do we say Lavan in the middle, or do we not say Lavan in the middle? Okay, now we're going to continue. Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi. Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi darshant. If you have a house that got a hole in the middle and you put schach on it, ksheira, it is kosher. Why is it kosher? You got non-kosher schach surrounding it. You got a kosher area in the middle. Why is that going to be kosher? The law of doifen akuma. This is the law that we've mentioned. We even had this specific case in the Mishnah. The house that has a hole in the middle, it is going to be a kosher sukkah as long as you have up to 4 cubits of non-kosher schach. That's fine. More than 4, if you have 4 cubits or more, then it's going to be invalid. So Amar lefanov Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi said in front of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, he said, Rabbi, teacher, Parish, you should explain your words as follows. In other words, you didn't qualify your statement. Kach Piresh Abba, this is what my father, Rabbi Yossi, explained and qualified this Mishnah, that Arba Amos Pesula, 4 Amos is invalid. Hachas me Arba Amos is Ksheira. That in the law of this bias shenifchas, this law that the ceiling has a hole in it, and you put schach on that hole and it's kosher, that it has to be qualified. That applies if it's up to if it's less than 4 cubits, it's kosher. That's only if it's less. If it's 4 cubits or more, it's going to be invalid because the law of doif and akuma no longer will kick in. So now the Gemara continues and it brings another case where Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi also says a similar thing. I'm thinking that I went to the grave of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi. I think it's right outside of Tzfas. Anyway, I think that's where he's buried. Anyway, so he said another statement as well, and he didn't seem to explain himself. Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, Avruma, a type of fish that's a small fish. It's called the Avruma fish. Avruma, like maybe sardines or something like that. It's a type of fish that are small. So Avruma Sharia is kosher. So I'm Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi says, "What? You just say that like you're just giving this blanket permit? Parish, Rabbi, my teacher Parish, you should explain your words." In Kach Amar Rabba, this is what my father said. Shalmakam Plaini is Asura. If they're Avruma, if it's these sardines from this place, then Asura, it is prohibited because in that place there's a lot of non-kosher types of shrutzim, fish, maybe shrutzei amayim, maybe fish that are mixed with them, and it's impossible to differentiate them, and therefore in that place you can't even have the avruma fish, even though the avruma itself is kosher, but you can't have it because it gets mixed with non-kosher fish. So if it's from that place, it's usher. Shel bakam plaini is muteris, but if it's of a different place, it's going to be permissible, and that's what you have to clarify. You have to qualify when you make such a statement. And so the Gemara says. So the commentaries explain over here. So why didn't Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi? Why didn't he explain his words and say about the sukkah and about the fish? So the commentaries explain that basically Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, he follows the opinion that a sukkah has to be 4 cubits, and he follows that view. I don't know if you remember such a view. We know that the common view and the accepted view is 7 handbreadths. But we did have that view of Rebbe that a sukkah needs to be 4 cubits in order to be a kosher sukkah, because they hold diras keva, it has to be more permanent, and so on. There was such a view earlier on in the tractate. Now, according to that view, and there's also another statement of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, and that is that he mentions that there is it mentions that what is the size of a big house, of a tracklin? What are the sizes of these? A small house, a big house. So in Tractate Baba Basra, he gives measurements, what these sizes are. One of them is a small house, he says, is 6 by 8 cubits. A big house is 8 by 10 cubits. A tracklin, a palace, is 10 by 10 cubits. Can you imagine? That was their big thing. 10 cubits, 15 feet by 15 feet or so. That was their big palace, is a tracklin. Now, if you think about it, he holds that a sukkah has to be 4 cubits in order to be kosher. Now, if you have a tracklin, if you have this palace that's 10 cubits by 10 cubits, so even if your sukkah is that big, imagine a sukkah, the tracklin, this is a palace, 10 cubits by 10 cubits. Would it be a kosher if you have the middle of it is fell in, had a hole, and you filled it with schach? Would such a thing work? So, what do you think? Do you have to qualify such a law?
Sure.
Just think about this. You have a a sukkah that's the size of a palace. It's 10 cubits by 10 cubits. It was a house. It was a palace, and the roof fell in. It was a bayis shenifchas. It was a palace, a house that got a hole in it. So, and someone comes to you and asks you, "I have a palace. The roof fell in, and I want to put schach there. Can I put schach there?" Do you have to go and ask the guy, "Oh, how much space is there in between the hole in the wall?" So in Rabbi Yehuda Bar Iloi's area, you don't have to ask that question. You know why? Because even if it was a palace that was 10 cubits, the sukkah needs to be 4 cubits. So how much space do you have from the 4 cubits? Even if your sukkah is the smallest size, according to Rabbi Yehuda Bar Iloi, 4 cubits by 4 cubits, that's his opinion.
But it's going to be exactly right.
Side.
It's going to be exactly right.
How much space will be on each side? 3 cubits.
3 cubits on each
3
side.
Cubits. So you should have no problem having a kosher sukkah without with no shilas. I don't have to qualify it.
In other words, it was implied by there's no such thing, basically, is what he's saying.
There's no such thing to have a sukkah that would have too much space of wall of ceiling that would separate too much of a gap between the wall and the kosher schach. It doesn't. It's not possible in his area. So he didn't have to clarify it. However, Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold that way. So he says you got to clarify. In my area, we first of all we hold a sukkah could be 7 by 7. If a sukkah could be 7 by 7, then you could have a bigger gap. Then it would then the normal case would be you could have such cases. But in Rabbi Yehuda Bar Iloi didn't need to clarify and qualify his statement, because in his area that was the typical case that it would be very rare, extremely rare to have a problem, to need to qualify. Now, what about the case of of Ruma, these like type of sardines or some other small fish that often had non-kosher fish with it? And why didn't he clarify? Depends on the place. And the answer is because he was giving a psak for his area. In his area, there was no problem. The non-kosher fish didn't tag along with these avruma fish. The avruma fish were kicked them away. They wouldn't. They didn't have the non-kosher fish, and therefore he didn't have such a problem. They didn't have these non-kosher fish there. No one brought them. No one.
But in the other place, you could still eat them, but you had to examine the fish carefully to make sure you had the right one.
Well, I think that the understanding was it was impossible to get rid of it because they're so small. You wouldn't be able to separate them. That's what it sounds like. So, it's like nowadays many people don't eat raspberries, because raspberries, if you use a magnifying glass, you will see that raspberries have bugs.
Oh.
And many people stopped eating them over the last few years. In fact, we had a kashrus program in one of the shuls here that I went to, and he brought just a regular thing of raspberries and he handed them out, and he then came around and he showed you the bugs in the raspberries.
But only with the magnifying glass.
No. The magnifying glass allows you to see that it's a bug, but you could still see it even without the magnifying glass. You just wouldn't think that it's a bug, but you would see it. If it was only visible through a magnifying glass, it's actually not a problem.
Exactly.
But because it's visible without the magnifying glass, and the magnifying glass just shows you, he showed you like the legs,
But so then you see movement. You see the little dots are moving then.
Well, you didn't really see them moving much, but you did see the legs. Now, the thing is that it made it a lot easier nowadays, because with our cell phones, you take a picture and then you zoom in, and it really was it was like a whole different type of experience, because you really saw because everyone has a cell phone. You just snap a picture at the regular, and you expand it.
But it says in the Torah, "B'chol marei hakohen," he has to be able to see with his own eyes.
Right, you have to see
these
something.
Little differences, different colors, and everything. But if it's not by mare, then it's not the
Right.
same.
So here, so the problem in general with checking for bugs is you don't know what you're looking for. That's the general issue.
Let me tell you, I know.
Because what type of bugs do you see in romaine? Is this type of bug? What type of bug do you see in kale? You have to know what you're looking for. That's another thing. But anyway, the bottom line is that
So
at least there's a thought here that it could be that this type of fish is totally not acceptable in that area because it's impossible to
right.
to
So
separate it.
speaking of areas, Rabbi, I heard there's some out. My daughter-in-law, she's from Venezuela, but
Uh-huh.
apparently there's some places in Chile. If it's a very high altitude, apparently the bugs like it around low levels. They don't like very high altitudes. And at
Uh-huh.
certain altitudes, once you reach a certain altitude, the bugs don't live up there. So if you could grow stuff up at a high altitude, and seal it till it gets to you, then apparently the bug
Uh-huh.
it depends on the place. Like we're saying here, depends on the place. Um,
Hmm. So you're saying
so
like if you grow it like on the top of a how what type of altitude are you talking about?
it's
Top of
got
a
to be
mountain?
pretty high. It's like
Uh-huh.
7,000 feet or something like
Oh.
that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
We're talking pretty high up.
Right.
Also, I'm
Right.
curious if David has a picture of this fish that we're talking this in his I
David,
know he's on there, but he's on mute with no video. But just wondering if he
right.
has a picture of this a rumma fish. I'm just curious.
David, where are you when we need you? All right. Well, anyway, so that's that's basically these two cases where Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi did not did not qualify his statement, and Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi spoke about how his father said these laws. Then the Gemara continues, and it talks about Kihad the Amar Abai talks about this case of the fish, similar to the case where Abai says Hai Tzachanta, or this type of Tzachanta fish, which is also a small fish, the Vav Nahara of Bav Nahara of the river of Bav. Nahara means a river of Bav. Sharia is permissible to eat. The Gemara says, "My timer, what's the reason? Why are you worried about the non-kosher fish? Maya, is it because the water is it goes so strong? There's a stream, is such a strong stream. Maybe the non-kosher fish, Vahai Dag Tame, the non-kosher fish, it's called the Dag Tame. It's called the term used as impure fish. It's any fish that's non-kosher, it's called impure. So the impure fish is kivan the lesle chut hashedra, the non-kosher fish, they don't have a spine. So because they don't have a spine, they can't exist against that stream.
All
The
right.
stream the current is too strong, and therefore maybe that's the reason. So Gemara says no. We do see that they are able to go against the current, even strong currents. So Ela Mishum de Maliche Mayat, because the water is salty in that area of Nahara of Bav, the Bav River. That's because the water is salty. But unless they kill feed, and the non-kosher fish, it doesn't have scales. So guess what? That because it doesn't have scales, it feels that salt. And lematzi kai, you can't exist there because of the saltiness of the water. And the scales normally would protect it, but because of the salt, it can't protect it, and therefore, so that might be a thought that's why it's kosher. The Gemara says no. That also we do see that they exist even in salt water. The reason is the mud doesn't cause these type of non-kosher fish to grow there. It's just simply some natural thing that for some reason it doesn't. They don't grow there, and they don't attach to the fish, and that's why it's this type of mud doesn't allow the dag tame to the non-kosher fish to grow there. And Amar Ravina says, now that we've spilled all the other rivers into that river, Asira, that now you can't even eat that fish. over there, because all the other non-kosher fish have been pouring into that river from outside and won't grow these non-kosher fish. But if you bring them there and distribute them there, they will attach themselves to the tzachanta fish, and therefore now you can't even have the tzachanta fish of Nahara of Bav. So that no tzachanta fish for that river anymore.
On the menu.
We're going to conclude here. Zygazon, have a wonderful
All right.
day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
How was the
Okay.
bar mitzvah?
Bar mitzvah was very, very nice. Very nice.
Mazel tov.
A lot of people. He spoke nice. He leaned. He davened. He was the chazan.
Beautiful.
Very nice. Baruch Hashem.
All right. Semachot.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you. Mazel tov.
Okay, and don't forget about the $50 reward. Anyone who fills out that does the review questions.
Very hard.
Sei gesund.